verse 2, it says, "Now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand." That's important how you read that. There's something that jumps out in verse 2. Notice what it calls it now, the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles. So there were 3 times a year that a Jewish man was obligated to go to Jerusalem. It was the Feast of Tabernacles, sometimes called the Feast of Booths, the Passover, and Pentecost. 3 times a year, a Jewish male was required to go to Jerusalem for those feasts. Now in here, it's odd that John reports in verse 2 that he calls it now the Jews' feast. Because in Leviticus 23:2, there's 7 feasts that it talks about, and they're called the Feast of the Lord. At one time, these feasts belonged to God. Now, it's no longer identified with God, but now is identified as the Jews' feast. God's no longer associating His name with these feasts. Now, feast doesn't mean a big meal. It means an appointed time. God in Leviticus had set appointed times for His people to come out of the world and to come back and to remember Him and to draw near in their heart towards Him and to worship Him and to celebrate Him for the things that He had done in their lives. It was appointed times. Somewhere along the line, they lost the meaning of that. And it became more about them, more about business, more about making money and things like that. And they had lost their heart for God. And the feast now has become more about them, exchanging money and things like that in Jerusalem. They had lost their heart for God. And God is no longer identified with this feast in verse 2. He calls it the Jews' feast. Think about that, because sometimes that happens in our churches, doesn't it? Sometimes that happens with us as believers because we have appointed times, particularly the Lord's Day, that God has called us to come out from the world and to come and let our hearts draw near to Him, and our affection and our adoration and our mind be set on Him, to love Him, to worship Him, and to learn from Him through the teaching of Scripture. And it's supposed to be all about Him and nothing about us. And sometimes we get so caught up in the things that we do that we lose the meaning of it. And sometimes it becomes about us and what I can get out of it and what the church can do for me or what I can do for the church. And we lose the heart for God. You ever seen that in a church? I have. Guess what? It can happen to anybody. It can happen here. Amen. That we come here for the wrong reasons other than our hearts drawing near to Christ and learning about Him and loving Him and worshiping Him with our whole heart. So he called it the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles. That particular feast was a remembrance of when God led them out of Egypt. And they dwelt in tents. They lived in tents. Yet God cared for them and fed them and took care of them every single day as He was leading them on their wilderness journey. And so in the Feast of Tabernacles, Jews would come and they would move out of their homes and live in leafy tents for 8 days to celebrate and remember what God did back in the wilderness over in the Old Testament.